The Gorbals, an area of Glasgow that conjures up images for anyone with more than a passing knowledge of central Scotland. With some of the oldest parish lands in the area is steeped in history. By the 19th century, and with the increase of industry, immigrants from all over came to the Gorbals. From the Highlands, Ireland, and as far as Russia, all found a home in the Gorbals. Perhaps most famous image of the Gorbals is the high-rise buildings of the 60s. Later torn down in the 90s, they were meant as an answer to the rising population problems. Within the Gorbals there is a cemetery by the name of the Southern Necropolis. In the 1700s, the dead were buried there in long trenches, covered by loose boards, until they were full, and then they were closed over. There was a movement afoot in Europe at the time to properly bury the dead, and as part of that, the necropolis of Glasgow was opened in the merchant city in the early 1830s. By the late 1840s, the Southern Necropolis was officially opened to afford the less affluent and dignified place of burial. Originally covering 7 acres, it is now around 21 acres and holds over 250,000 bodies. All cemeteries have some stories and legends, the older ones more so, but the Southern Necropolis holds perhaps one of the strangest for its sheer magnitude as reported in the newspapers at the time. 64 years ago, on the 23rd of September 1954, Police Constable Alex Deeprose was called to a disturbance at the Southern Necropolis. On arrival, he found more than 100 children invading the graveyard. In the contemporary newspaper, he is reported as saying that he felt like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, with all shapes and sizes of children streaming after him, and they were all talking at once, talking about a vampire with iron teeth. The children that he talked to claimed it had killed 2 children. Between 100 and 200 school-aged children overran the graveyard, claiming they had seen a vampire. Locally known to the children as the Gravy, the South Necropolis, against the backdrop of the glow and smoke of the steelworks, dull red in the evening of a Glasgow autumn, making for a very eerie scene. The Daily Mirror reported a couple of days later that the trouble started at 4 on a Thursday when the schools were closing for the day. Hundreds of children had banded together determined to slay the vampire, which they believed had been roaming the cemetery. Even infants, just able to toddle, apparently were in the mob. They were armed with sticks and stones, and some say knives, and one even had a crucifix, and off they set for the cemetery, gathering recruits as they marched through the streets. The rain was what finally made the children go home that night, along with the stern headmasters of the local schools. But they came back the next night, just as soon as school was let out. They continued to return in ever-reducing numbers each night until the interest in the hunt faded. The newspapers even reported the death of the Gorbals vampire to try and dissuade more hunters. A couple of boys at the time have spoken. Tam Smith described walls lined with people. He says they ventured through the gatehouse and there were loads of kids in there. Some were wandering around, some were sitting on the walls, and there were people with dogs, mums and dads with their kids. Tam says he found a place to sit out the way because there were so many people. He says that the whole of the Gorbals was in that graveyard. Another boy who was 8 at the time, Ronnie Sanderson, says, "I just remember scampering home to my mother, who asked, 'What's the matter with you?' And he said he'd seen a vampire and he got a clout round the ear for his trouble. He says he didn't even know what a vampire was then. PC DeProse later said he could handle all this, but when the grown-ups approached him and asked in earnest, "Is there anything to this vampire story?" it made him think. Official records have no children reported missing or dead. This was a time before television, and the sharing of stories was far more common. The imagination of the children was blamed for running wild, inspired by biblical stories of Daniel, as was a turn-of-the-century poem called Jenny with Iron Teeth. There was one more tangible accusation: the arrival of American horror comics. One particular comic of the same time period was actually called The Vampire with the Iron Teeth. There's no evidence any of the children had these comics. However, a year later, a group of Christians and Communist Party members, strange bedfellows, passed a bill through government called the Children and Young Persons Harmful Publications Act of 1955. There have only been a handful of charges under this act. Was there a vampire? Probably not. The incident is true, and it's been reported in numerous publications at all levels of repute then and since. The children of the time remember the terror and the rumours that brought them to the necropolis. Somewhat ironically, the story is now immortalised in comic book form. Today, the Southern Necropolis is surrounded by modern buildings, a refuge of the past in the midst of the modern. As with all cemeteries, it is a strange place, a liminal space between the living and the dead. There are some who say there was a vampire. And recently, sightings have begun again.